Sometimes the cruelest betrayal comes from those who should protect you most. When grief is still fresh and hope feels lost, family can become your greatest enemy. Clara Bell learned this hard truth when her husband's family threw her and little Elsie out into the Wyoming winter of 1871. With nowhere to go and no one to turn to, she faced the kind of choice no mother should ever make. But sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. Silas Creed was a wealthy cattle baron who had given up on people long ago. Yet when he found Clara and her daughter near frozen on his land, something stirred in his hardened heart. What he didn't expect was how saving them might just save himself. But when Clara's cruel family returns to claim what they once discarded, will Silas fight for the only real family he's ever known? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wyoming Territory in December of 1871 was no place for the weak or foolish. Snow fell in sheets across the endless expanse of prairie, transforming the landscape into a white desert where a man could lose himself for days and never find his way home. The wind carried a bite that could freeze a soul solid, and the silence stretched so far it seemed to swallow hope itself. Silas Creed knew this country like a preacher knows his Bible. He'd carved his empire from this unforgiving land, building the largest cattle operation between Cheyenne and the Montana border. His ranch house stood like a fortress against the elements, solid timber and stone, built to last generations. The barn could shelter 300 head of cattle, and his corrals stretched for acres. By any measure, Silas Creed was the richest man for 200 miles in any direction. Yet wealth couldn't fill the hollow spaces in a man's chest. At 43, Silas had the weathered look of someone who'd seen too much and said too little. His hands were calloused from honest work, despite having enough money to hire others for the labor. His dark hair showed silver at the temples, and his blue eyes held the kind of distant sadness that comes from carrying regrets too heavy to set down. Every evening he sat alone at a dining table built for 12, eating meals prepared by his housekeeper while the wind rattled the windows and reminded him of just how alone a rich man could be. The leather journal he kept in his desk drawer told a story he'd never shared with another living soul. Pages filled with careful script detailed not his business dealings or cattle counts, but the ghosts that haunted his conscience. The family he'd lost to his own ambition, the chances he'd let slip away while chasing fortune, the debt he owed to a world that had given him everything except peace. 3 days before Christmas, Silas was checking fence lines along his southern border when he spotted something that didn't belong in the white wilderness. At first, he thought it might be an injured animal, a dark shape moving slowly against the snow. But as he urged his horse closer, the shape resolved into something that made his blood run cold. A woman, barely upright, struggled through knee-deep snow with a small child clinging to her back. They moved with the desperate, stumbling gait of people who had reached the end of their strength but refused to stop. The woman's dark coat was thin and inadequate against the bitter cold, and the child, a little girl, he realized wore layers of fabric that looked more like rags than proper winter clothing. Silas didn't hesitate. He'd seen death stalking the prairie before, and these two were walking straight into its embrace. "Ma'am!" he called out, spurring his horse forward. The woman looked up at the sound of his voice, and Silas saw something in her face that hit him like a physical blow. Not just exhaustion or fear, but a bone-deep weariness that spoke of losses too great to bear. She was young, maybe 25, with auburn hair escaping from beneath a threadbare shawl and green eyes that held equal measures of desperation and fierce determination. The little girl on her back couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Her face was pale with cold, her lips tinged blue, but she clung to her mother with the trust that only children possess. "Please," the woman whispered as Silas dismounted. Her voice was barely audible above the wind. "My daughter, she needs warmth. I can pay. She fumbled in her coat with shaking hands, producing a simple gold wedding band. "It's all I have, but—" Silas held up a hand to stop her. "Keep your ring, ma'am. No payment needed." He shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around both mother and child. "Can you ride?" The woman nodded, though Silas could see the effort it took to remain standing. He lifted the little girl first, settling her in the saddle, then helped the woman mount behind her. The child's eyes were wide and solemn, and when Silas met her gaze, she whispered, "Mama said angels would help us." Something twisted in Silas's chest. "Well, I'm no angel, little one, but I've got a warm house and hot food waiting." He led the horse on foot, setting a careful pace through the snow. The woman, Clara, she'd told him when he'd asked, remained silent during the trek, but he could feel her watching him, studying him perhaps, trying to determine what kind of man had found them in their darkest hour. The ranch house appeared through the swirling snow like something from a dream. Lamplight glowed in the windows, and smoke rose from the chimney in a steady column. To Clara's eyes, it must have looked like salvation itself. Silas's housekeeper, Mrs. Henderson, took one look at the bedraggled pair and sprang into action. She was a practical woman in her 50s who'd been running the Creed household for nearly a decade. Within minutes, she had Clara and the little girl Elsie. Her name was wrapped in warm blankets and seated by the fire with bowls of beef stew warming their frozen hands. "Mercy's sake," Mrs. Henderson clucked as she bustled around the kitchen. "What were you thinking, traveling in this weather? Don't you know this country can kill the unprepared?" Clara's voice, when she finally spoke, carried the refined accent of someone who'd known better days. "We had little choice, ma'am. Sometimes moving forward is the only option left." Silas found himself studying Clara as she fed spoonfuls of stew to her daughter. Even exhausted and travel-worn, there was an elegance to her movements, a quiet dignity that spoke of good breeding. Her hands, though rough from hard work, were graceful. Her clothes, though patched and faded, had been well made once. "Where were you headed?" he asked gently. Clara's hands stilled. "West, California, perhaps. Somewhere we could start fresh." She lifted her chin with a pride that reminded Silas of a wounded animal trying not to show weakness. "We're not asking for charity, Mr. Creed. If you could spare some supplies, food, perhaps a warmer coat for Elsie, I'll find a way to repay you." "Mrs. Bell," Silas said, and Clara startled at his use of her married name. He'd noticed the pale band of skin on her ring finger where a wedding band had recently rested. "When did you lose your husband?" Tears gathered in Clara's eyes, though she refused to let them fall. 2 months ago. Pneumonia took him quick." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "His family, they said I wasn't worthy of their name, that Elsie and I were burdens they couldn't afford to keep." The simple cruelty of it struck Silas like a blow. He'd known hardship, but he'd never experienced the particular brand of betrayal that came from family turning their backs when support was needed most. "And they turned you out?" "In winter." Clara's silence was answer enough. Silas felt something stir in his chest, an old anger mixed with a protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. He looked at little Elsie, who had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, and made a decision that would change all their lives. "You'll stay here," he said quietly. "Through the winter, at least. Spring's a better time for traveling, and this country's no place for a woman and child alone." Clara's eyes widened. "Mr. Creed, we couldn't impose. It's not an imposition." Silas's voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to having his word obeyed. "Mrs. Henderson could use help with the household, and I could use the company. This house was built for a family, Mrs. Bell. It's been empty too long." As if summoned by his words, Mrs. Henderson appeared with an armload of warm quilts. "I've prepared the blue room upstairs," she announced. "It's got a good fireplace and a view of the mountains. The little one can sleep with her mama until we get a proper bed set up." Clara looked between Silas and Mrs. Henderson, and for the first time since he'd found her, something like hope flickered in her green eyes. "You're very kind," she whispered. "Both of you. I promise we won't be a burden." Silas reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the leather journal, its pages filled with the weight of his regrets. He thought of all the kindnesses he'd failed to show, all the chances he'd missed to be better than he was. "Ma'am," he said softly, "sometimes helping others is the only way a man can help himself." As Clara carried her sleeping daughter upstairs, following Mrs. Henderson's lamplit guidance, Silas remained by the fire. Outside, the wind continued to howl across the empty prairie, but inside, for the first time in years, the house didn't feel quite so hollow. He opened his journal and wrote a single line. "Today, I found them. Or perhaps they found me." Clara woke to the sound of absolute silence. For a moment, she lay still in the soft bed, disoriented by the absence of wind rattling through gaps in walls or the distant sounds of other families stirring in cramped quarters. The blue room, as Mrs. Henderson had called it, was larger than any space Clara had called home since her marriage. Weak morning light filtered through clean windows, revealing furniture that spoke of comfort and permanence, things she'd almost forgotten existed. Beside her, Elsie slept deeply, her small face peaceful for the first time in weeks. The child's cloth doll, a simple creation Clara had sewn from scraps during their desperate journey, lay clutched in her tiny arms. The doll was barely more than stuffed rags, but it had been Elsie's constant companion through their darkest days. Looking at it now, Clara felt a surge of gratitude that her daughter still had something to hold on to. The smell of bacon and fresh bread drifted up from the kitchen below, making Clara's stomach clench with hunger. She'd grown so accustomed to rationing their meager food supplies that the idea of a full meal seemed almost sinful. Yet Mr. Creed had insisted they were welcome to whatever the house could provide. Silas Creed. Clara turned the name over in her mind as she carefully extracted herself from the bed, trying not to wake Elsie. The man was a puzzle wealthy beyond anything she'd known, yet choosing to live alone in this magnificent house. There was a sadness about him that she recognized, the particular weight that came from carrying losses too heavy to share. She'd seen it in her own mirror these past months. Downstairs, she found Mrs. Henderson already bustling about the kitchen, humming softly as she worked. The older woman looked up with a warm smile when Clara appeared. "Good morning, dear. I hope you slept well. Coffee's fresh, and there's plenty of breakfast if you're hungry." "You're very kind," Clara said, accepting a cup of the rich, dark coffee. It had been months since she'd tasted anything so good. "Is Mr. Creed about?" "Oh, he's been up since before dawn, checking on the cattle. Man never rests, that one. But he'll be back soon enough." Mrs. Henderson's expression grew thoughtful. "Can I speak plainly, Mrs. Bell?" Clara nodded, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "Mr. Creed's a good man, but he's been alone too long. This house needs life in it, laughter, conversation, the sound of people who care about each other. You and that sweet child of yours, you're already bringing something back that's been missing for years." Before Clara could respond, the kitchen door opened and Silas entered, stamping snow from his boots. His cheeks were ruddy from the cold, and his eyes brightened when he saw Clara at the table. "Morning, Mrs. Bell. I trust you slept well?" "Better than I have in months, thank you." Clara studied his face, noting the genuine concern there. "Mr. Creed, about yesterday I want you to know how grateful we are. But I also want to earn our keep. I'm handy with cooking, cleaning, mending, whatever needs doing." Silas poured himself coffee and settled across from her at the kitchen table. "Mrs. Henderson runs this household just fine, but I won't refuse willing hands if you're offering them. There's always work on a ranch." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of small feet on the stairs. Elsie appeared in the doorway, her hair tousled with sleep, still clutching her cloth doll. She looked around the kitchen with wide eyes, as if trying to convince herself it was real. "Mama," she whispered. "Come here, sweet girl," Clara said, opening her arms. Elsie ran to her, burying her face against Clara's shoulder. Silas watched this tender reunion with something approaching wonder. It had been so long since he'd witnessed the simple intimacy between parent and child. Mrs. Henderson, bless her heart, set a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of Elsie without being asked. "What's your doll's name?" Silas asked gently. Elsie peeked at him shyly. "Hope," she whispered. "Mama made her when Papa went to heaven." The simple innocence of the child's faith hit Silas like a physical blow. Hope, this ragged little doll, represented everything this small family was clinging to. "That's a beautiful name," he said softly. "Hope's important. Sometimes it's all that keeps us going." Over the following days, a routine began to establish itself. Clara threw herself into helping Mrs. Henderson with household tasks, bringing an efficiency and grace to the work that hadn't been there before. She mended clothes with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, cooked meals that filled the house with warmth and wonderful smells, and gradually began to transform the sterile perfection of Silas's home into something that felt alive. Elsie, meanwhile, seemed to bloom in the safety and warmth of the ranch house. Her laughter echoed through rooms that had been silent for too long, and she followed Silas around like a devoted puppy whenever he was in the house. On the fourth day, Silas made a decision that surprised even himself. He found a piece of soft pine wood and his whittling knife and began carving. His hands, more accustomed to handling reins and branding irons, worked slowly but surely, shaping the wood into the form of a small horse. "What are you making?" Elsie asked, appearing at his elbow as he worked by the firelight. "A friend for Hope," Silas replied, holding up the partially carved figure. "Every doll needs a horse, don't you think?" Elsie's face lit up with pure joy. "If your mama says it's all right." Clara, who had been quietly mending by the fire, looked up at them both. The sight of this gruff, wealthy man patiently carving a toy for her daughter stirred something deep in her chest, a feeling she'd thought buried with her husband. "I think Hope would love a horse," she said softly. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Clara and Elsie no longer eating in the kitchen, but joining Silas in the formal dining room, at his insistence, the conversation flowed easier than it had since their arrival. "Tell me about your husband," Silas said gently, as Mrs. Henderson cleared their plates. It was the first time he'd asked directly about Clara's past. Clara was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently turning the wedding ring she wore on a chain around her neck. "Thomas was a good man, kind, gentle. He worked as a clerk in his father's general store back in Missouri. We didn't have much, but we were happy." Her voice grew soft with memory. "He used to say that happiness wasn't about what you owned, but who you shared it with." "Wise man," Silas murmured. "When he got sick, pneumonia came on so fast, his family blamed me. Said I should have called the doctor sooner, should have done more. After he died, they told me I was a burden they couldn't afford. That Elsie wasn't really family since she was just a girl." Clara's voice hardened. "They gave us 3 days to pack what we could carry and get out." The casual cruelty of it left Silas speechless. He'd known hard men, selfish men, but the idea of turning out a grieving widow and her child was beyond his understanding. "Where were you planning to go?" he asked. "California, maybe. I have a cousin there who might take us in. Or Oregon Territory. I heard there are opportunities for people willing to work hard." Clara lifted her chin with that familiar pride. "We'd have made our way somehow." Silas looked across the table at this remarkable woman who'd faced such betrayal, yet refused to let it break her spirit. Then he looked at little Elsie, drowsing contentedly in her chair, the wooden horse he'd carved, resting in her lap alongside her precious doll. "Mrs. Bell," he said quietly, "what if I told you that you don't have to keep running, that there might be a place for you here permanently?" Clara's green eyes searched his face, looking for the trap, the conditions that would make such generosity impossible to accept. "Mr. Creed, we couldn't." "Hear me out," Silas said, leaning forward slightly. This ranch needs a woman's touch. Mrs. Henderson's getting on in years, though she'd box my ears for saying so. And Elsie, well, she's brought something to this house that's been missing too long. Joy, hope, the sound of a child's laughter. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm not talking about charity, Mrs. Bell. I'm talking about partnership. You'd earn your keep, have your own income, your own security. Elsie could grow up safe, educated. She could have a real home. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. It was everything she'd dreamed of during those dark nights on the trail. Safety, stability, a future for her daughter. But there was something else in Silas's offer. Something that both thrilled and terrified her. "And what would you get from such an arrangement?" she asked quietly. Silas was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "A family," he said. "Something I thought I'd lost forever." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and hope. Outside, the Wyoming wind continued to howl across the prairie, but inside the ranch house, three people who'd been alone too long began to understand that sometimes the best families are the ones you choose. The proposal hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace, curling around them with both promise and uncertainty. Clara stared at Silas across the dinner table, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. A permanent home, security for Elsie, the chance to stop running and start living again. But what kind of partnership did he mean? "I need time to think," Clara said finally, her voice barely steady. "It's a generous offer, Mr. Creed, but I—" "Of course," Silas replied, standing from the table. "Take all the time you need. The offer stands whenever you're ready to discuss it." That night, Clara lay awake listening to Elsie's soft breathing beside her. Through the window, she could see the vast expanse of stars scattered across the Wyoming sky like scattered diamonds. So different from the narrow view she'd known in Missouri, where buildings and trees hemmed in the horizon. Here, the world seemed infinite with possibility. But possibility came with risk. Accepting Silas's offer would mean trusting a man she'd known for less than a week. It would mean building a new life in a place where winter could kill the unprepared, and the nearest neighbor was 20 miles away. Most frightening of all, it would mean opening her heart to the chance of loss again. The next morning brought the answer to questions she hadn't known how to ask. Clara found Silas in the barn, tending to a mare who was heavy with foal. He moved around the animal with practiced ease, his hands gentle as he checked her condition. There was something deeply reassuring about watching a man care for something vulnerable. "She's due any day now," Silas said without looking up. "First foal, sometimes the new mothers need extra attention." "Like people," Clara observed, stepping closer to stroke the mare's neck. "Exactly like people." Silas finally met her eyes. "Mrs. Bell, about last night, if my offer made you uncomfortable, I apologize. I don't want you feeling pressured or—" "It didn't make me uncomfortable," Clara interrupted. "It made me hopeful, and that scares me more than anything." Silas straightened, giving her his full attention. "Why?" "Because hope is dangerous when you've lost everything once before. Because I don't know what kind of partnership you're offering, and I don't know what you expect in return." She lifted her chin with that familiar pride. "I won't be anyone's charity case, Mr. Creed, and I won't be anyone's, my kept woman," Silas finished gently. "Mrs. Bell, I may be lonely, but I'm not without honor. What I'm offering is honest work for honest pay, nothing more. A business arrangement that benefits us both." Relief flooded through Clara so powerfully her knees nearly buckled. "Thank you for making that clear. There's something else you should know," Silas continued, his voice growing quieter. "About why this ranch matters so much to me, about what I meant when I said I owed the world a debt." Before Clara could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the house. Elsie's delighted laughter mixed with deeper voices, men's voices, and the sound of multiple horses. Ranch hands coming in for noon meal, Silas explained. But Clara caught something else in his expression. Relief, perhaps, at being interrupted before he revealed too much. They walked back to the house together, and Clara got her first real look at the men who worked for Silas Creed. There were 6 of them, ranging in age from a fresh-faced boy who couldn't be more than 16 to a grizzled veteran whose beard was white as fresh snow. They sat around the kitchen table with the easy familiarity of family, passing platters and ribbing each other with good-natured insults. "Boys," Silas said as they entered, "I'd like you to meet Mrs. Clara Bell and her daughter Elsie. They'll be staying with us for a while." The introductions were a blur of names and weathered faces. Jake Henley, the foreman, young Billy Patterson, old Pete Kowalski, who'd been with Silas since the beginning, Miguel Reyes, whose wife lived in town, Sam Fletcher, and Tom Bradley, who tipped his hat with particular courtesy. "Ma'am," Jake said, standing respectfully, "any friend of the boss is a friend of ours." What struck Clara most was how naturally they accepted her presence. No awkward questions about her circumstances or judgmental glances. These were men who understood that sometimes good people found themselves in bad situations through no fault of their own. "Elsie here was just showing us her horse," Billy said, grinning at the little girl who sat perched on Pete's knee. The wooden horse Silas had carved rested on the table beside her doll, and Elsie was clearly bursting with pride. "Mr. Silas made it for Hope," Elsie announced. "Now she can ride everywhere." "Well, ain't that something?" Pete said, his gruff voice gentle. "Finest horse I ever seen. Got good lines, strong legs. That there's champion breeding." Elsie giggled, delighted by the serious attention being paid to her toy. Clara watched this interaction with growing wonder. These rough men, who spent their days wrestling cattle and fighting the elements, were treating her daughter like precious family. Over the following weeks, a new rhythm established itself. Clara threw herself into the household work, but it was work that felt purposeful rather than desperate. She cooked hearty meals for the ranch hands, mended their clothes, and gradually began to feel like she was contributing something valuable rather than simply accepting charity. Mrs. Henderson, rather than feeling displaced, seemed to bloom under Clara's help. The older woman had been carrying the full burden of running the household alone, and having a younger pair of hands to share the load brought visible relief. "Haven't seen cooking like this since my own mother passed," Jake commented one evening after a particularly excellent beef stew. "Mrs. Bell, you're spoiling us something fierce." "Good food makes for good workers," Clara replied. But she couldn't hide her pleased flush at the compliment. Silas watched these interactions from his place at the head of the table, noting how Clara was gradually coming alive under the simple acceptance and appreciation of his men. The tight lines of worry around her eyes were softening, and her smiles came more easily each day. But it was Elsie's transformation that truly amazed him. The shy, the solemn child who'd arrived clinging to her mother was becoming a bright spark of energy, who chattered constantly and found wonder in everything, from the barn cats to the way snow crystals caught the morning light. "Uncle Silas," she said one evening, the title slipping out so naturally that everyone at the table went quiet. "Will you teach me to ride a real horse someday?" Silas felt his throat tighten at the casual endearment. When had he become Uncle Silas? When had this child decided he was worthy of such trust? "When you're a little older," he said gently. "But I promise I will. And will you teach me to rope cattle like Jake? If your mama says it's all right." Clara, who'd been listening to this exchange with a mixture of joy and trepidation, found herself nodding. "I think that would be fine." Later that evening, after Elsie had been tucked into bed with her wooden horse and doll, Clara found Silas on the front porch, despite the bitter cold. He stood looking out at his land, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. "She's never had a father figure," Clara said quietly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "Thomas died when she was so young she barely remembers him." "She's a remarkable child," Silas replied. "You've done well raising her alone. I've done my best." But watching her with you, with the men, I see what she's been missing, what we've both been missing." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in their own thoughts. "Mr. Creed," Clara said finally, "I've made my decision about your offer." The words hung in the cold air between them, and Silas felt his heart begin to race. He'd tried to tell himself that Clara's answer wouldn't matter too much either way, that he'd made his offer out of simple decency and could accept whatever decision she reached. But standing there in the frozen stillness of the Wyoming night, he realized he'd been lying to himself. Her answer mattered more than anything had in years. "I accept," Clara said simply. "If the offer still stands, I'd like to stay, permanently." Relief flooded through Silas with such force that he had to grip the porch railing to steady himself. "It stands," he managed. "Thank you, Mrs. Bell. I think this will be good for all of us." "There's something I need to tell you first," Clara continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "About why Thomas's family really turned us out. It wasn't just about money or burden." Silas waited, sensing the weight of whatever confession was coming. Thomas had a brother, Marcus. He always resented that Thomas inherited their father's favor, even though Marcus was older. After Thomas died, Marcus convinced the family that Elsie wasn't really Thomas's daughter. Clara's voice broke slightly. "He said terrible things. Called me unfaithful," said Elsie, "was proof of my sin." The casual cruelty of it hit Silas like a physical blow. Did they believe him? Some did. Others just found it convenient to believe. Either way, it gave them the excuse they needed to wash their hands of us. Clara turned to face him fully. "I wanted you to know because if they ever come looking, if they ever try to spread those lies here—" "They won't matter," Silas said firmly. "Anyone fool enough to look at that child and doubt her goodness isn't worth the air they breathe. You're both welcome here for as long as you want to stay." The gratitude in Clara's eyes was almost too much to bear. "How can I ever repay such kindness?" "By being happy," Silas replied. "By letting Elsie grow up safe and loved. By helping me turn this house into a home again." Over the following days, Clara threw herself into her new role with determined enthusiasm. She worked alongside Mrs. Henderson to reorganize the household, bringing efficiency and warmth to rooms that had been clean but sterile. Fresh bread appeared on the table daily, curtains were washed and mended, and flowers from Mrs. Henderson's carefully tended greenhouse began appearing in vases throughout the house. But it was the small changes that mattered most, the sound of Clara humming as she worked, Elsie's laughter echoing from the kitchen as she helped with cooking, the gradual replacement of formal silence with comfortable conversation. Silas found himself lingering in the house more often, drawn by the simple pleasure of hearing life happening around him. He'd catch Clara singing softly while she mended clothes by the fire, or discover Elsie having elaborate tea parties with her doll and wooden horse in the sitting room. "She's never had space to be a child," Clara confided one evening as they watched Elsie play. "We were always moving, always worried about where our next meal would come from. Here, she can just be 4 years old." "Children should get to be children," Silas replied, thinking of his own abbreviated childhood spent working to help support his family. "She'll grow up soon enough." One snowy afternoon, Silas made a decision that surprised even himself. He found Clara in the kitchen, teaching Elsie to knead bread dough. "Mrs. Bell," he said, "I was wondering if you and Elsie might like to come out to the barn with me. There's something I'd like to show you." Clara wiped flour from her hands and bundled Elsie into her coat. They followed Silas through the snow to the large barn, where warmth and the smell of hay greeted them. "Look there," Silas said softly, pointing to a stall in the back corner. The mare they'd visited weeks earlier was nursing a newborn foal, a beautiful chestnut with white markings on its face and legs. The baby horse was perhaps a day old, all legs and curiosity as it explored its new world. "Oh," Elsie breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. "Mama, look at the baby horse." She's beautiful, Clara said, genuinely moved by the sight. Silas corrected gently, and he needs a name. I was thinking perhaps Elsie might like to help with that. Elsie's face lit up like sunrise. Really? I can name him? If you'd like. Take your time. Think about it. A name's important. It's something he'll carry his whole life. As they stood watching the mare and foal, Clara felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't just kindness anymore. This was Silas actively creating bonds, weaving them into the fabric of his life in ways that would be impossible to undo cleanly. That evening, as the ranch hands gathered for dinner, Elsie announced her decision. "I'm going to call him Thunder," she declared solemnly, "because when he gets big, he'll run like thunder across the prairie." "Thunder's a fine name for a horse," Jake agreed seriously. "Strong name for a strong colt." "Will he really be mine?" Elsie asked, looking between Clara and Silas with hope and uncertainty. "He'll need training first," Silas said carefully, "and you'll need to learn to ride properly. But yes, when you're both ready, Thunder can be your horse." The generosity of it took Clara's breath away. A horse was valuable property, representing months of careful breeding and years of potential work. For Silas to give one to a 4-year-old child he'd known for less than a month spoke to either tremendous wealth or tremendous affection. Perhaps both. "What do you say, Elsie?" "Thank you, Uncle Silas," Elsie whispered. And again that casual title that seemed to grow more natural each time she used it. Later, after Elsie had been put to bed with excited chatter about her foal, Clara found Silas in his study. The room was lined with books and dominated by a massive desk covered with papers and ledgers. But what caught her attention was the open leather journal, its pages covered with careful script. "I'm sorry," she said, starting to back away. "I didn't mean to intrude." "It's all right," Silas said, closing the journal gently. "I was just writing about today, about Thunder and Elsie's joy. Sometimes important moments deserve to be remembered." "You keep a diary?" "Of sorts. Mostly just thoughts, regrets, things I wish I'd done differently." He set the journal aside and gestured to a chair. "Please, sit. There's something I'd like to discuss." Clara settled herself, noting the serious tone in his voice. "I want to make our arrangement official," Silas continued. "Legal papers, proper contracts. Not because I don't trust your word, but because I want you to have security. Something in writing that can't be taken away if something happens to me." The practical implications of what he was suggesting hit Clara immediately. Legal security meant true independence. It meant she'd never again be dependent on family goodwill or masculine charity. "What kind of arrangement?" she asked carefully. "Partnership in the household management, with a yearly salary, guardian rights for Elsie if needed, a permanent place here regardless of circumstances." Silas paused. "And I'd like to set up an account for Elsie's future, education, dowry when she's older, whatever she might need." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Such generosity went far beyond simple kindness. This was Silas actively choosing to bind his future to theirs, creating legal obligations that would protect them even if his feelings changed. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do so much for strangers?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. "Because I had a family once, a wife, a daughter. I lost them through my own selfishness and ambition. I can't bring them back. But maybe I can keep history from repeating itself with another family that needs protection." The weight of his confession settled between them like a living thing. Clara understood now why he carried such sadness, why this house had felt so empty despite its grandeur. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "That must have been—" "It was my own fault," Silas interrupted. "I chose business over family, wealth over love. By the time I realized what I'd lost, it was too late to fix it." Clara reached across the space between them and gently touched his hand. It's never too late to choose differently going forward. Looking into her understanding eyes, Silas felt something long frozen begin to thaw in his chest. Winter deepened around the Creed ranch like a comfortable embrace, wrapping the household in a cocoon of warmth and growing familiarity. Clara had been there 6 weeks now, and the rhythms of daily life had settled into something that felt remarkably like home. The legal papers Silas had mentioned were drawn up by a lawyer from Cheyenne, ensuring Clara's position and Elsie's future with ironclad certainty. But with security came new complications. Clara found herself watching Silas with different eyes now, noting the way his face softened when Elsie climbed onto his lap after dinner, or how he always made sure the coffee was fresh when she came downstairs in the mornings. Small kindnesses that spoke of attention and care beyond mere hospitality. It was dangerous territory for a woman who'd sworn to never again depend on masculine protection for her survival. One particularly cold morning, Clara was hanging wash in the kitchen when she noticed Silas standing by the window, staring out at the snow-covered fields with an expression she couldn't quite read. His leather journal lay open on the table beside him, and she caught a glimpse of fresh writing. "Planning your spring cattle drives?" she asked, joining him at the window. "Something like that." Silas closed the journal with a soft snap. "Actually, I was thinking about improvements. Adding onto the house, maybe. The east wing could use expansion." Clara studied his profile, noting the careful way he wasn't meeting her eyes. "More room for what? A proper nursery, perhaps. And Elsie will need her own room as she gets older. A girl should have space for her things, privacy to grow up properly." The casual mention of future plans that included them sent a flutter of both joy and anxiety through Clara's chest. Silas was thinking in years, not months. He was planning a life that included her and Elsie not as temporary guests, but as permanent family. "That's very thoughtful," she said carefully, "but perhaps we should see how this winter goes before making such significant plans." Silas finally turned to look at her, his blue eyes holding a warmth that made her breath catch. "Mrs. Bell, I think you should know this isn't an experiment for me. Having you and Elsie here, it's changed everything. This house feels alive again." Before Clara could respond, a commotion erupted from upstairs. Elsie's voice, high and distressed, called for her mama. Clara rushed toward the stairs with Silas close behind. They found Elsie in the blue room, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her cloth doll. Hope's fabric arm had torn, and stuffing was leaking onto the floor. "Mama, Hope is hurt," Elsie sobbed. "I was playing, and she got caught on the bed frame, and now she's broken." Clara knelt beside her daughter, examining the damage. The seam had pulled apart completely, and the carefully preserved doll, Elsie's constant companion through their darkest days, looked beyond simple repair. "Oh, sweetheart," Clara murmured, her heart breaking at her daughter's distress. The doll represented so much more than a toy. It was security, comfort, a tangible link to the love that had sustained them through loss. "Can you fix her, Mama? Please?" Clara looked at the torn fabric and realized with sinking certainty that Hope couldn't be mended. The material was too worn, the damage too extensive. But how could she tell her 4-year-old daughter that sometimes things broke so badly they couldn't be repaired? "Let me see," Silas said quietly, kneeling beside them. He took the damaged doll with gentle hands, examining the tear with the same careful attention he'd give to valuable tack or injured livestock. "The stuffing can be replaced," he said thoughtfully, "and I might be able to patch this tear. But she'll need some new fabric, something strong enough to last." "I have some material," Clara offered. "Scraps from mending. We could—" "Actually," Silas interrupted, "I have a better idea. There's a trunk upstairs in the room that used to be—" He paused, his voice catching slightly. "There's material there. Good fabric, meant for a little girl's dresses. It's been sitting unused for years. Maybe it's time it served its purpose." Clara understood immediately. Fabric meant for his daughter, the child he'd lost. The generosity of offering such precious remnants took her breath away. "Are you sure?" she asked softly. "More than sure. Come with me." They climbed to the third floor, to rooms Clara hadn't explored. Silas led them to a door that clearly hadn't been opened in years. Inside was a child's room, perfectly preserved but covered in dust. A small bed with carved headboard, shelves lined with books and toys, and in the corner a cedar trunk. Elsie's tears stopped as she stared around the room in wonder. "Whose room was this, Uncle Silas?" "It belonged to a little girl named Mary," Silas said quietly. "She would have been about your age if things had been different." He opened the trunk, revealing layers of carefully preserved fabric, beautiful cottons and soft wools, clearly purchased with love and never used. At the very bottom lay a child's quilt, embroidered with flowers and butterflies. "This room's been empty too long," Silas continued, lifting out a piece of sky-blue cotton printed with tiny white flowers. "Perfect for Hope's new dress, don't you think?" Elsie nodded solemnly, seeming to understand the significance of what was happening, even if she couldn't articulate it. Over the next 2 hours, Clara worked carefully to repair Hope, while Elsie watched anxiously. Silas helped, his large hands surprisingly deft with needle and thread. Together, they not only mended the tear, but created an entirely new outfit for the doll, a proper dress with tiny buttons and even a miniature petticoat. "She's beautiful," Elsie breathed when they finished. Hope looked transformed, her new blue dress making her seem almost real. "Thank you, Mama. Thank you, Uncle Silas. Why don't you show Hope her new dress in the mirror?" Clara suggested, wanting a moment alone with Silas. After Elsie had run off with her restored treasure, Clara touched Silas's arm gently. "That was an extraordinary kindness. Using Mary's fabric, it must have been difficult." "It felt right," Silas replied. "That material was bought with love, meant to bring joy to a child. What better purpose could it serve?" Clara studied his face, seeing both old pain and new peace there. "Would you tell me about them? Mary and your wife?" Silas was quiet for so long, Clara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with regret. "Elizabeth was the prettiest girl in Denver when I married her. I was nobody then, just a ranch hand with big dreams and small prospects. She believed in me when nobody else would." He touched the edge of the trunk, his fingers tracing the wood grain. "Mary came along 2 years later, bright as sunshine, curious about everything. She had Elizabeth's laugh. What happened? I got ambitious. Started buying land, building the herd, making deals that kept me away for weeks at a time. I told myself I was building something for them, but really, I was building something for me. When the fever came through diphtheria, I was in California closing a cattle deal." Clara felt her heart clench with sympathy. "Oh, Silas, they died alone while I was making myself rich. By the time I got the telegram and rode home, they'd been buried 3 days. His voice broke slightly. "I never even got to say goodbye." The weight of his guilt was so palpable Clara could almost touch it. This explained the empty grandeur of his house, the careful distance he'd maintained from human connection, the debt he felt he owed the world. "You couldn't have known," she said softly. "I could have been here, should have been here. Instead, I chose money over family, just like I always did." Silas closed the trunk with finality. "I swore I'd never let that happen again. Never again would I put anything before the people who mattered." Clara understood now why her and Elsie's presence meant so much to him. They represented redemption, a chance to choose differently, to protect instead of abandon. "We're here now," she said simply. "You're choosing differently now." Looking into her understanding eyes, Silas felt the crushing weight of 15 years of guilt begin to lighten just a fraction. The revelation about Silas's lost family changed something fundamental in the household. Clara found herself watching him with new eyes, seeing past the wealthy rancher to the grieving father who'd spent 15 years carrying unbearable guilt. His small kindnesses toward Elsie took on deeper meaning, each patient lesson about ranch life, every carved toy, all the gentle attention he paid to her childish concerns represented acts of redemption. But with understanding came complications Clara hadn't anticipated. 3 days after their conversation in Mary's room, Clara was kneading bread when she noticed Silas standing in the kitchen doorway, simply watching her work. There was something in his expression, a longing so profound it made her hands still on the dough. "Is everything all right?" she asked quietly. "I was just thinking," Silas replied, stepping into the kitchen, "about how different this house feels now. How alive." Clara resumed her kneading, hyper-aware of his presence. "It's good to feel useful. It's more than that." Silas moved closer, and Clara caught the scent of leather and winter air that seemed to cling to him. "Clara, may I call you Clara?" The use of her given name sent a flutter through her chest. "Of course. Clara, I need you to know what's growing between us. It's not just gratitude or convenience. I've come to care for you and Elsie in ways that go far beyond our business arrangement." The words hung in the warm kitchen air like a confession. Clara set down her dough and turned to face him fully, her heart racing. "Silas," she began, then stopped. What could she say? That she'd noticed the way he looked at her? That she'd begun thinking of him not as her employer, but as something much more dangerous to her carefully guarded independence? "I don't expect anything," Silas continued quickly. "I know you've built walls for good reasons. I just wanted you to understand my feelings for you are real." Before Clara could respond, the kitchen door burst open and Elsie bounded in, her cheeks red with cold and her eyes bright with excitement. "Mama, Uncle Silas, come see Thunder. He's running in the snow." The moment shattered, but Clara caught Silas's eye and saw understanding there. They would finish this conversation, but not now. Not with little ears listening. Over the following days, an undercurrent of tension ran through their interactions. Not unpleasant tension, but the awareness that something significant had shifted between them. Clara found herself noticing details she'd tried to ignore: the way Silas's hair curled slightly at his collar, how his hands moved with unconscious grace as he worked, the rare but devastating effect of his genuine smile. Mrs. Henderson, with the perceptiveness of someone who'd spent decades managing households, certainly noticed the change. "That man's been alone too long," she observed one afternoon as she and Clara prepared dinner. "Never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Mrs. Henderson: "Oh, don't mind me, dear. I'm just saying it's good to see him remembering what happiness looks like. You're good for each other." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "We have an arrangement, a business partnership." Mrs. Henderson replied with a knowing smile. "If you say so." That evening, after Elsie had been tucked into bed with her restored doll and wooden horse, Clara found herself restless. She wandered through the house, noting how much it had changed since her arrival. Fresh flowers graced the tables, children's drawings decorated the kitchen walls, and the formal dining room had become a place of laughter and conversation rather than silent meals. She ended up in the sitting room, where Silas sat reading by the fire. He looked up when she entered, setting aside his book. "Can't sleep?" he asked gently. "Too much to think about." Clara settled in the chair across from him, noting how natural this felt, two people sharing companionable evening silence. "About what I said in the kitchen?" Clara nodded. "Among other things. Silas, you have to understand I've built my entire sense of safety around not needing anyone, not depending on masculine protection or provision. The idea of caring for someone again, it terrifies me." "I understand that fear," Silas replied. "After Elizabeth and Mary died, I swore I'd never again risk loving someone I could lose. But Clara, what kind of life is that? What's the point of survival without connection? It's safe and empty." They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Clara spoke again. "When Thomas died, his family didn't just turn us out. They made sure everyone in town knew their version of the story. By the time we left Missouri, I couldn't walk down the street without seeing judgment in every face. People I'd known for years suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. Silas felt anger rise in his chest at the casual cruelty she'd endured. Their opinions say nothing about you and everything about them, perhaps. But once you've been branded with shame, it follows you. I can't go through that again. I won't subject Elsie to it. What if I told you that wouldn't happen here? That my word carries enough weight in this territory to protect you from gossip and judgment? Clara looked at him sharply. Are you asking? I'm saying that if you ever decided you wanted more than a business arrangement, I'd be honored to give you my name. Legal protection, social standing, security that no one could take away. Silas leaned forward slightly. But only if you wanted it. Not out of gratitude or necessity, but because you chose it. The proposal, for that's what it was, even unspoken, hit Clara like a physical force. Marriage to Silas would solve every practical problem she faced. It would give Elsie legitimacy, security, a father figure who clearly adored her. It would provide Clara with the kind of protection and status that could shield them from the world's harshness. But it would also mean surrendering the independence she'd fought so hard to build. I need time, she whispered. Of course, as much as you need. And I need to know, what would you expect? What kind of marriage? Silas was quiet for a long moment. The kind Elizabeth and I had, before I became so consumed with building an empire. Partnership, companionship, shared joys and sorrows. Love, if it comes naturally. And if it doesn't come naturally, then friendship and respect, shared commitment to giving Elsie the best life possible. I've learned the hard way that a house full of wealth means nothing without people to share it with. Clara stared into the fire, her mind spinning. The practical part of her catalogued the benefits, security, legitimacy, protection. But her heart whispered something more dangerous, that she was already halfway in love with this complicated, generous man who'd given them salvation when they needed it most. There's something else, she said finally. If we were to consider such an arrangement, I'd want more children. I always imagined Elsie having brothers and sisters. The longing in Silas's eyes was answer enough. I'd like that very much. Then I'll think about it. Seriously consider it. That's all I can ask. As Clara made her way upstairs, she caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror. For the first time in months, the woman looking back at her didn't appear hollow with grief or tight with worry. She looked like someone who was remembering what hope felt like. In her room, Elsie slept peacefully, clutching hope in her newly mended dress. The sight of her daughter's innocent trust made Clara's decision feel both more urgent and more terrifying. Whatever choice she made would shape not just her own future, but Elsie's as well. Clara had been wrestling with Silas's proposal for 3 days when the sound of approaching horses shattered the winter stillness. It was early afternoon, and she was teaching Elsie to embroider by the sitting-room window when she spotted the riders, 4 men on horseback, moving with the determined purpose of people who'd traveled a long distance with a specific destination in mind. Something cold settled in her stomach as she recognized the lead rider, Marcus Bell. Thomas's older brother, the man who'd orchestrated their exile from Missouri with his poisonous accusations and cruel manipulations. "Mama!" Elsie sensed her mother's sudden tension. "Who are those men?" Clara's hands shook as she set aside her needlework. "Go find Mrs. Henderson in the kitchen, sweetheart. Stay with her until I come get you." "But, Mama." "Now, Elsie, please." Elsie scampered away, leaving Clara alone to watch her worst nightmare approach the house. She'd always known this moment might come, that Thomas's family might eventually decide they'd made a mistake in discarding her and Elsie. But she'd hoped distance and time would be protection enough. By the time the riders reached the front porch, Silas had emerged from the barn with Jake and 2 other ranch hands. Clara watched through the window as Marcus dismounted, his expensive coat and city bearing marking him as an outsider in this rough country. The three men with him looked like hired help, not ranch hands, but the kind of men who solve problems with violence when necessary. Clara forced herself to walk to the front door, arriving just as Marcus raised his hand to knock. "Hello, Marcus," she said, opening the door before he could announce himself. Marcus Bell was a soft man who'd never done hard work in his life. Where Thomas had been gentle and kind, Marcus was cruel and petty. His pale eyes swept over Clara with the same disdainful assessment she remembered from Thomas's funeral. "Clara," his voice held no warmth, "you're looking well for someone who's been living in poverty." "What do you want, Marcus?" "To collect what belongs to our family. Surely you didn't think you could run away with Thomas's daughter and face no consequences." Behind Marcus, she could see Silas approaching with purposeful strides. His face was carefully controlled, but she caught the dangerous glitter in his eyes that suggested barely contained anger. "Gentlemen," Silas said as he reached the porch, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to command. "I'm Silas Creed. This is my land. What's your business here?" Marcus turned to assess this new player, and Clara saw calculation in his expression as he took in Silas's obvious wealth and bearing. "Mr. Creed, I'm Marcus Bell, and this is family business. We've come to collect my brother's widow and his daughter. Have you now?" Silas's voice remained level, but Clara heard the steel underneath. "And does Mrs. Bell want to be collected?" "What she wants is irrelevant," Marcus replied with casual arrogance. "She's family, and family takes care of its own." "Funny," Silas observed. "From what I understand, family already had its chance to take care of Mrs. Bell and chose to turn her out instead." Marcus's face flushed with anger at having his actions so bluntly characterized. "That was a misunderstanding. We've come to make amends, to bring Clara and the child home where they belong." "And if I choose not to go?" Clara asked, finding her voice. "You don't have a choice," Marcus replied. "As Thomas's brother, I have legal rights regarding his daughter. A child belongs with blood family, not strangers." The threat was clear, and Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She'd been so focused on building a new life that she'd forgotten how little legal protection women had, especially when family came calling with claims on their children. "I see," Silas said quietly. "And what exactly are you claiming, Mr. Bell?" "Guardianship of my niece. Authority over her care and upbringing. Clara can come along if she chooses to behave properly, but the child comes with us either way." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. This was worse than simple retrieval. Marcus was threatening to separate her from Elsie entirely if she didn't comply with his demands. "And if Mrs. Bell were to remarry," Silas asked, "if she had a husband's legal protection?" Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "To whom? Some rough cowboy looking for free labor and feminine companionship? Clara's damaged goods. No respectable man would have her." The casual cruelty of it hit Clara like a physical blow, but before she could respond, Silas stepped forward with deadly calm. "Mr. Bell," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "you're standing on my porch, insulting a woman under my protection. I suggest you choose your next words very carefully." Something in Silas's manner finally penetrated Marcus's arrogance. The soft city man suddenly seemed to realize he was facing someone far more dangerous than he'd anticipated. "We're not looking for trouble," Marcus backtracked slightly. "We just want what's rightfully ours." "Nothing here is rightfully yours," Silas replied. "Mrs. Bell and her daughter are guests in my home, under my protection. If you have legal claims, present them to the territorial court. Otherwise, I suggest you ride back, wherever you came from." "You can't protect her forever," Marcus said, his voice turning ugly. "We have resources, connections. If we choose to pursue this legally—" "Then pursue it," Silas interrupted. "But do it from somewhere else. You're not welcome here." Marcus looked between Silas and Clara, clearly reassessing his position. He'd come expecting to find a desperate woman with no options and no protection. Instead, he'd found someone willing to stand between him and what he wanted. "This isn't over," Marcus warned. "Clara, you're making a mistake. That child belongs with her father's family, not with some stranger who's using your desperation for his own purposes." "The only mistake I made was believing family meant something to people like you," Clara replied, finding her strength. "Elsie is my daughter, and she'll stay where she's loved and protected." "We'll see about that," Marcus said. He gestured to his companions, and they began moving toward their horses. "Enjoy your temporary sanctuary, Clara. It won't last forever." As the riders disappeared into the afternoon snow, Clara felt her legs go weak. She sank onto the porch steps, shaking with reaction and fear. "He can do it," she whispered. "Legally, he can take her. A father's family has rights that supersede a mother's wishes, especially if they can prove I'm unfit." Silas sat beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "What kind of proof?" "Living unmarried with a man, accepting charity. They'll twist our arrangement into something shameful, make it seem like I'm—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Then we don't give them the opportunity," Silas said quietly. Clara looked at him, hope and fear warring in her chest. "What do you mean?" "Marry me. Tonight, if possible. Tomorrow, at the latest." Silas turned to face her fully. "Not because you have to, but because you want to. Because it's what we both want anyway, and this just makes the timing urgent." "Silas, I love you, Clara. I love Elsie as if she were my own daughter. I want to spend my life protecting and caring for both of you. If Marcus Bell wants to challenge a married woman's custody of her own child, let him try. My name carries weight in this territory, and my lawyers are better than his." Clara stared at him, her heart racing. It was everything she'd been considering, compressed into a moment of crisis that demanded immediate decision. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "Once we do this, there's no going back. You'll be legally responsible for both of us." "I've been responsible for you in my heart since the day I found you," Silas replied. "The legal part is just paperwork." Clara thought of Elsie inside the house, playing innocently while vultures circled outside. She thought of Marcus's threats, of the legal vulnerability that came with being a lone woman in a world controlled by men. But mostly she thought of the last 2 months of feeling safe, valued, loved in ways she'd forgotten were possible. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." Silas's relief was visible. "Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for choosing us," Clara replied, "even when it's complicated." As they sat together on the porch, watching the snow fall, both understood that everything had changed. The comfortable progression toward deeper relationship had been replaced by urgent necessity. But looking into each other's eyes, they also understood that necessity didn't diminish the genuine feeling that had been growing between them. They were about to become a family not just in their hearts, but in the eyes of the law. The next 12 hours passed in a whirlwind of preparation that left Clara feeling as though she was watching someone else's life unfold. Silas rode hard to Cheyenne through the snow, returning before dawn with a territorial judge, a marriage license, and 2 witnesses, the kind of legal firepower that only serious money could command on such short notice. Clara found herself standing in Silas's sitting room at 7 o'clock in the morning, wearing her best dress, a simple green wool that had seen better days, but was clean and pressed, clutching a small bouquet of winter roses that Mrs. Henderson had somehow procured from the greenhouse. Elsie stood beside her in a new dress made from fabric found in Mary's room, her eyes wide with excitement at the unfolding drama. "Do I call you Papa now?" Elsie had asked when they explained what was happening. "If you'd like to," Silas had replied gently. "But Uncle Silas is fine too, until you decide what feels right." The judge, a weathered man named Samuel Morrison who'd known Silas for 15 years, conducted the ceremony with efficient solemnity. The ranch hands served as additional witnesses, all of them dressed in their Sunday best and beaming with approval. Jake stood as Silas's best man, while Mrs. Henderson served as Clara's matron of honor, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Do you, Silas Creed, take Clara Bell to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do." "Do you, Clara Bell, take Silas Creed to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Clara hesitated for just a moment, not from doubt, but from the magnitude of the moment. She was about to become Clara Creed, with all the protection and obligation that name carried. More than that, she was choosing love over fear, partnership over independence, hope over the safe isolation she'd built around her heart. "I do," she said clearly. "By the power vested in me, by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Creed, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, respectful, but Clara felt the promise in it, the commitment to the partnership they were creating together. When they separated, she saw tears in Silas's eyes that matched her own. "Welcome to the family, Mrs. Creed," he whispered. Mrs. Creed. Clara tried the name silently and found it fit better than she'd expected. The celebration that followed was warm but brief coffee and fresh biscuits in the kitchen, while the judge prepared the legal documents that would protect Clara's rights as both wife and mother. But even as they laughed and accepted congratulations from the ranch hands, Clara felt an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with wedding nerves. Marcus Bell wouldn't give up easily. Men like him didn't accept defeat gracefully, especially when their pride was involved. The marriage provided legal protection, but it also gave Marcus new ammunition. He could claim Clara had married hastily to avoid his legitimate family claims, that her new husband was somehow complicit in keeping Elsie from her rightful relatives. As if reading her thoughts, Judge Morrison approached her as she signed the marriage certificate. "Mrs. Creed," he said quietly, "Silas told me about your visitors yesterday. I want you to understand your legal position now that you're married." Clara nodded, grateful for his directness. "As a married woman, your husband now has legal authority over both you and any children from previous marriages. But more importantly, any challenge to your daughter's custody would have to prove that both you and Silas are unfit guardians. Given Silas's standing in this territory, that would be virtually impossible unless they could prove actual abuse or neglect." Relief flooded through Clara. "So Elsie is safe? Legally?" "Yes, but I'd advise caution. Family disputes can get ugly, especially when money and pride are involved. If these Bell relatives are determined to cause trouble, marriage alone might not be enough to discourage them." After the judge and witnesses departed, Clara found herself alone with Silas in the sitting room where they'd been married less than an hour before. The ranch hands had returned to work. Mrs. Henderson was cleaning up from the impromptu celebration, and Elsie was napping upstairs, exhausted from the excitement. "Any regrets?" Silas asked gently. "About marrying you?" "No." Clara smoothed her skirt nervously. "About the circumstances that forced our timeline?" "Yes. We could have taken longer, courted properly," Silas agreed. "But Clara, I want you to know this isn't just a marriage of convenience for me. What I said yesterday was true. I love you. I love Elsie. I want to build a real life together. Even though I come with complications, with people who might cause you trouble." Silas moved to the window, looking out at his land. "Do you know what I was thinking about during the ceremony?" Clara shook her head. "I was thinking about how quiet this house used to be, how I could go days without hearing another person's voice except for ranch business. How empty that felt, even when I told myself I preferred the solitude." He turned back to her. "Clara, you and Elsie didn't bring complications into my life. You brought life itself. If Marcus Bell wants to challenge that, he'll find I'm not the soft target he expects. The conviction in his voice sent a thrill of both gratitude and concern through Clara. "I don't want you hurt because of my past. And I don't want you hurt because of small-minded people who don't understand what family really means." Silas crossed to her, taking her hands in his larger ones. "We're in this together now. Whatever comes, we face it as a team." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching again. Clara felt her blood go cold. Surely Marcus wouldn't return so soon. But when she looked out the window, she saw different riders. Two men in official-looking coats, moving with the measured pace of law enforcement rather than the aggressive urgency of yesterday's visitors. "Territorial marshals," Silas observed grimly. "That was faster than I expected." Clara felt panic rise in her throat. What do they want? Only one way to find out. Silas straightened his shoulders, and Clara caught a glimpse of the steel that had built his empire. "But whatever they're here for, remember your Clara creed now. You're under my protection, and in this territory, that means something." They met the marshals on the front porch. The older of the two men dismounted and approached with official courtesy. "Mr. Creed, ma'am, I'm Marshal Stevens, and this is Deputy Walsh. We're here on official business regarding a complaint filed in Cheyenne yesterday evening." "What kind of complaint?" Silas asked. "Kidnapping and unlawful detention of a minor child, specifically one Elsie Bell. The complaint was filed by Marcus Bell, claiming custody rights as the child's uncle and next of kin." Marshal Stevens consulted his notes. "We're here to investigate the allegations and ensure the child's welfare." Clara felt the world tilt sideways. Kidnapping. Marcus was claiming she'd kidnapped her own daughter. "I see," Silas said calmly. "And what exactly are you investigating?" "We need to speak with the child, verify her identity and circumstances. We also need to understand the living arrangements here and the relationship between all parties involved." "That's easily arranged," Silas replied. "But I should inform you that circumstances have changed since yesterday. Clara Bell is now my wife, legally married this morning, with proper documentation." Marshal Stevens raised an eyebrow. "This morning? Rather sudden, isn't it? When you find the right person, why wait?" Silas's voice held just the right note of romantic conviction. "I've been courting Clara for weeks. Yesterday's visit from her late husband's family simply provided the final encouragement we needed." Clara admired his ability to frame their hasty marriage as romantic impulse rather than legal desperation. But she could see skepticism in the marshal's eyes. "We'll still need to speak with everyone involved," Marshal Stevens said, "including the child." "Of course, but I trust you'll conduct your investigation with appropriate sensitivity. Elsie is only 4 years old, and she's been through considerable trauma already." As they prepared to face official scrutiny of their new family, Clara felt the weight of everything they'd built together hanging in the balance. The marshals seemed professional and fair, but they were also bound by law to investigate Marcus's claims thoroughly. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway as if summoned, and Clara was grateful for the older woman's steady presence. "Shall I wake Elsie?" she asked quietly. "In a few minutes," Clara replied. "Let me talk to her first, prepare her." As she climbed the stairs to wake her daughter, Clara's mind raced. How do you explain to a 4-year-old that her uncle is trying to take her away? How do you prepare a child for questions from strangers who hold her fate in their hands? At the top of the stairs, she paused outside Elsie's door, gathering strength for what might be the most important conversation of their lives. Through the window at the end of the hall, she could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon, a fitting backdrop for the battle that was about to unfold. Inside the room, Elsie slept peacefully, her cloth doll Hope clutched in her arms, and the wooden horse Silas had carved resting on the pillow beside her. Looking at these simple tokens of love and security, Clara felt her resolve strengthen. They'd built something beautiful here, something worth fighting for. And with Silas beside her, she was ready to fight for it with everything she had. Clara knelt beside Elsie's bed, gently touching her daughter's shoulder. The little girl stirred, blinking sleepy eyes in the afternoon light filtering through the curtains. "Mama? Is it dinner time?" "Not yet, sweetheart, but there are some men downstairs who need to talk to us. They're lawmen like sheriffs, and they want to make sure you're safe and happy here." Elsie sat up, clutching hope to her chest. "Are they going to take us away?" The innocent question hit Clara like a physical blow. How much had Elsie understood about yesterday's confrontation with Marcus? "No, baby. They just want to ask some questions. Remember how we practiced talking to grown-ups? How you should tell the truth and speak clearly?" Elsie nodded solemnly. "That's all you need to do. Tell them how you feel about living here, about Uncle Silas, about Mrs. Henderson. Can you do that for me? Will you be there? Right beside you, the whole time." They went downstairs together, Clara's heart pounding with each step. In the sitting room, she found the Marshalls seated across from Silas, who rose when they entered. His calm presence steadied her nerves. "This must be Elsie," Marshal Stevens said kindly. "Hello, young lady. I'm Marshal Stevens, and this is Deputy Walsh. We just want to talk with you for a few minutes." Elsie pressed closer to Clara's side, but answered politely, "Hello." "What a pretty doll," the Marshal observed, noting Hope in Elsie's arms. "What's her name?" "Hope. Mama made her when Papa went to heaven, but she got hurt, and Uncle Silas helped fix her." Elsie held up the doll to show off her new blue dress. "Uncle Silas did that?" "That was very kind. He carved me a horse too, and he's teaching me about Thunder, that's my very own foal. When I'm bigger, I'm going to ride him all over the ranch." Clara watched the Marshalls exchange glances. Whatever they'd expected to find, it clearly wasn't a happy, well-cared-for child chattering excitedly about horses and adopted uncles. "Elsie," Marshal Stevens continued gently, "can you tell me about the men who came yesterday? Do you remember them?" Elsie's expression grew more serious. "Uncle Marcus came with some other men. He made Mama sad. Did he hurt you, or your mama?" "No, but he talked mean. Uncle Silas told them to go away. Were you scared?" Elsie considered this carefully. "A little, but Uncle Silas and Mama were there, so I knew I was safe." Deputy Walsh spoke for the first time. "Elsie, do you like living here?" "Oh, yes." Elsie's face lit up. "Mrs. Henderson makes the best cookies, and Uncle Silas is teaching me to whistle, and Jake lets me help feed the chickens. And there's so much room to play, and everyone is nice to me and Mama." "What about your Uncle Marcus? Did you know him before yesterday?" Elsie shook her head. "Mama said he was Papa's brother, but I never met him. He said I should come live with him, but I want to stay here. This is my home now." The simple declaration hung in the air. From the mouths of babes, Clara thought. Even a 4-year-old could see what Marcus refused to acknowledge, that love and care mattered more than blood relations. Marshal Stevens made some notes, then looked up at Clara. "Mrs. Creed, can you walk me through how you came to be here?" Clara took a breath and told the story: Thomas's death, his family's rejection, their desperate flight west, Silas finding them nearly frozen in the snow. She kept her voice steady and factual, letting the simple truth speak for itself. "And your marriage to Mr. Creed this morning? We'd been discussing it for weeks," Clara replied, staying close to Silas's earlier explanation. "Marcus's visit yesterday simply made it clear that waiting served no purpose." "I can show you the engagement ring," Silas interjected smoothly, producing a simple gold band from his pocket. "I'd been carrying it for days, waiting for the right moment to propose properly." Clara stared at the ring, genuinely surprised. When had he acquired it? The detail of his planning took her breath away. "May we see your marriage certificate?" Deputy Walsh asked. Silas produced the document, signed by Judge Morrison, and properly witnessed. Everything was legally impeccable. Marshal Stevens studied the papers, then looked around the comfortable sitting room, noting the children's drawings on the walls, the toys in the corner, the evidence of a well-run household. "I'll need to speak with your household staff as well," he said finally. "Of course, Mrs. Henderson has been my housekeeper for nearly 10 years. She can speak to the household arrangements." Over the next hour, the marshals interviewed Mrs. Henderson, Jake, and 2 other ranch hands. Each painted the same picture: a happy child, thriving in a loving environment, a woman who'd brought life and warmth to a previously empty house, a man who clearly cherished his new family. "One more question," Marshal Stevens said, as the interviews concluded. "Mr. Bell claims you've been living here unmarried for months, that there's been impropriety. Mrs. Henderson can attest that Clara and Elsie have had their own rooms since arrival," Silas replied calmly. "Our courtship has been entirely proper." "Mrs. Henderson nodded firmly. "Mr. Creed is a gentleman, Marshal, always has been." Marshal Stevens closed his notebook. "Based on what I've seen today, I'll be reporting that the child is well cared for and clearly wishes to remain in her current situation. The marriage appears legitimate, and there's no evidence of coercion or impropriety." Clara felt her knees nearly buckle with relief, but Marshal Stevens wasn't finished. "However, Mr. Bell has retained a lawyer and is threatening court action. He claims there are irregularities in your husband's death certificate and questions about the child's parentage that need resolution." The words hit Clara like a slap. Marcus was dragging out his old accusations, using them as weapons in official proceedings. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means this isn't over." The courtroom in Cheyenne was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread throughout the territory about the custody case that pitted blood family against chosen family, and it seemed everyone had an opinion about where a child belonged. Clara sat between Silas and their lawyer, Marcus Thornfield, a sharp-eyed man from Denver whom Silas had retained at considerable expense. Across the aisle, Marcus Bell sat with his attorney and what appeared to be half the Bell family from Missouri. They'd arrived in force, clearly intending to overwhelm any opposition with sheer numbers and righteous indignation. Judge Morrison presided over the proceedings, his weathered face giving nothing away as he reviewed the briefs both sides had submitted. Elsie was mercifully absent. Thornfield had argued successfully that a 4-year-old shouldn't be subjected to courtroom testimony, and the judge had agreed to conduct any necessary interviews in his chambers. "This court is called to order," Judge Morrison announced. "We're here to determine the custody of Elsie Bell, specifically to address the petition filed by Marcus Bell claiming guardianship rights as the child's uncle." Marcus Bell's attorney, a thin man named Pemberton, stood first. "Your Honor, this case is straightforward. Mr. Bell seeks custody of his deceased brother's child, who has been unlawfully removed from her rightful family by a woman of questionable character." Clara felt Silas tense beside her, but Thornfield remained calm. "The evidence will show," Pemberton continued, "that Clara Bell has engaged in immoral conduct, living unmarried with a man, and that her hasty marriage was clearly designed to circumvent legitimate family claims. Furthermore, we have reason to question whether the child in question is even a legitimate member of the Bell family." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Mr. Thornfield," Judge Morrison invited. Their attorney rose smoothly. "Your Honor, this case represents nothing more than the vindictive actions of a family that callously abandoned a grieving widow and child, only to change their minds when it became clear that child had found happiness and security elsewhere. The evidence will show that Clara Creed legally married, and now Mrs. Silas Creed has provided exemplary care for her daughter, and that the Bell family's claims are based on malice rather than genuine concern for the child's welfare." The first witness called was Marcus Bell himself. Under direct examination, he painted a picture of a concerned family desperate to reunite with a lost child. "We made a mistake," he admitted with practiced remorse. "We were grieving Thomas's loss and didn't handle Clara's situation well. But family is family, Your Honor. Elsie belongs with her blood relatives. But under Thornfield's cross-examination, the truth emerged more clearly. Mr. Bell, isn't it true that you personally ordered Mrs. Bell to leave your family's property within 3 days of your brother's funeral? We were all emotional. Yes or no, Mr. Bell? Did you give her 3 days to leave? Yes. But, and isn't it true that you publicly questioned the legitimacy of Elsie's birth? Marcus Bell's face flushed. I had concerns. Did you or did you not suggest that Elsie was not your brother's child? Yes, but I was wrong about that. How convenient that you discovered your error only after learning that Mrs. Bell had found security and happiness elsewhere. The testimony continued for hours. Mrs. Henderson took the stand, describing in vivid detail Clara's exemplary care for Elsie and the transformation of the Creed household. Jake testified about seeing a happy child who called Silas uncle with genuine affection. Then Marshal Stevens testified about his investigation, confirming that he'd found no evidence of impropriety or neglect, only a well-cared-for child in a loving home. The turning point came when Thornfield called Dr. William Hayes, the physician who had attended Thomas Bell's death in Missouri. Doctor, you were present when Thomas Bell died of pneumonia. I was. In his final hours, did Mr. Bell express any wishes regarding his wife and daughter? Dr. Hayes glanced toward Marcus Bell before answering. He did. He specifically asked me to ensure that Clara and Elsie would be cared for. He was very worried about what would happen to them. Did he express any doubts about Elsie's parentage? Absolutely not. He spoke of her as his beloved daughter, worried about her future. Did anyone else hear these final wishes? Yes. Marcus Bell was present for part of the conversation. A hush fell over the courtroom. Marcus Bell had heard his brother's dying wishes and chosen to ignore them. But Pemberton wasn't finished. He called his final witness a private investigator who claimed to have uncovered irregularities in the timing of Elsie's birth relative to Thomas and Clara's marriage. The dates suggest the child was conceived before the marriage, the investigator testified. This raises questions about legitimacy. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. It was true she and Thomas had been intimate before their wedding, and Elsie had been born 8 months later. But the implication being drawn was false and devastating. Thornfield rose for cross-examination with deadly calm. Sir, are you suggesting that a child born 8 months after her parents' marriage is illegitimate? The timing raises questions. Are you a physician? No. But are you qualified to determine the gestation period of a pregnancy? I'm simply stating facts. The fact is that premature birth was common in 1867, particularly given the hardships of frontier life. The fact is that Thomas Bell acknowledged Elsie as his daughter without question. The fact is that your insinuations are based on prejudice, not evidence. Judge Morrison called a recess, and Clara found herself trembling in the hallway outside the courtroom. They're destroying my reputation, she whispered to Silas. Making me look like a woman who loved her husband before the law said she could, Silas replied firmly. Clara, half the people in this territory have similar stories. Thornfield knows what he's doing. When court reconvened, Judge Morrison's expression was grave. I've heard enough testimony to make my decision. Judge Morrison's weathered hands rested on the polished wood of his bench as he surveyed the packed courtroom. The silence was absolute, every person present understanding that the next words would determine the fate of one small girl and the family that loved her. In matters of child custody, the judge began, his voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench, the court must consider what serves the best interests of the child above all other considerations. Blood relationship, while important, is not the sole determining factor. Clara felt Silas take her hand, his strong fingers intertwining with hers. Across the aisle, Marcus Bell leaned forward, his face tense with anticipation. The court has heard testimony regarding the circumstances that led to Mrs. Clara Creed and her daughter leaving Missouri. The evidence clearly shows that the Bell family, led by Marcus Bell, made a conscious decision to reject their responsibility to care for a grieving widow and child. They cast out a woman in her most vulnerable hour, subjecting her and her daughter to the dangers of winter travel with no resources or protection. Judge Morrison's eyes found Marcus Bell in the gallery. Mr. Bell's claim that this rejection was a mistake born of grief is contradicted by his own testimony about questioning the child's legitimacy, questions he admits were unfounded. More damning still is Dr. Hayes's testimony that Mr. Bell was present when his dying brother specifically requested protection for Clara and Elsie, wishes that were completely ignored. Marcus Bell's face had gone pale, and several of his family members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The court finds that the Bell family forfeited any moral claim to custody when they abandoned their responsibilities. Furthermore, the timing of their renewed interest, occurring only after Mrs. Creed found security and happiness, suggests motives other than genuine concern for the child's welfare. Clara felt tears of relief begin to gather, but Judge Morrison wasn't finished. Regarding the allegations of impropriety concerning Mrs. Creed's conduct, the court finds no credible evidence to support such claims. The testimony of Marshal Stevens, Mrs. Henderson, and multiple ranch employees consistently describes a woman of excellent character, providing loving care for her child. The suggestion that her marriage to Mr. Creed was improper or fraudulent is contradicted by the evidence of their genuine courtship and the clear benefit this union provides to young Elsie. The judge paused, his eyes moving to where Clara sat. "Mrs. Creed, would you please stand?" Clara rose on unsteady legs, Silas standing beside her in solidarity. "The court finds that you have demonstrated exceptional devotion to your daughter's welfare, showing remarkable courage in protecting her from those who would harm her. Your choice to build a new life, rather than accept charity from those who had rejected you, shows both wisdom and strength." Judge Morrison turned his attention to Silas. "Mr. Creed, your willingness to open your home and heart to a woman and child in need speaks to your character. The court notes that you have provided not merely financial security, but genuine love and family connection. Young Elsie's obvious affection for you, calling you uncle with such natural trust, demonstrates the quality of care you provide." The judge picked up his gavel, and the courtroom held its collective breath. Therefore, it is the ruling of this court that Marcus Bell's petition for custody is denied. Elsie Bell Creed shall remain in the custody of her mother, Clara Creed, and her stepfather, Silas Creed. Furthermore, this court hereby grants Mr. Creed full adoption rights, making him Elsie's legal father in all respects. The gavel came down with finality, and the courtroom erupted. Clara felt her knees buckle, but Silas caught her, pulling her into his arms as the reality of their victory washed over them. "It's over," he whispered against her hair. "She's ours. You're both safe." Across the aisle, Marcus Bell sat frozen in shock before being led away by his deflated legal team and disappointed family members. His schemes had not only failed, but had been publicly exposed and condemned. 3 months later, spring came early to the Wyoming Territory. Clara, now showing the gentle curve of pregnancy with the child she and Silas had created together, sat on the front porch, watching Elsie play in the yard with a litter of puppies. The little girl's laughter carried on the warm breeze, a sound that never failed to fill Clara's heart with joy. Thunder, now a yearling, grazed peacefully in the nearby paddock. Though still too young to ride, the young horse had bonded with Elsie just as Silas had promised, following her around the barnyard like an oversized pet. "Mama, look!" Elsie called out, holding up her cloth doll. Hope wore yet another new dress, this one made from cheerful yellow fabric that Mrs. Henderson had ordered specially from Denver. "Hope likes the puppies." "I can see that, sweetheart," Clara replied, her hand resting on her growing belly. Soon, Hope would have a real baby to help care for. Silas emerged from the barn, his sleeves rolled up from afternoon work. His face lit up when he saw his family gathered in the spring sunshine, his pregnant wife, his adopted daughter, and the ranch that was finally, truly a home. "Any news from town?" Clara asked as he settled beside her on the porch swing. "Jake heard that Marcus Bell sold his business in Missouri. Seems he's moving to California, starting over somewhere new." Clara felt a moment of something that might have been pity. Marcus had lost more than a legal case. He'd lost the chance to know the remarkable little girl Elsie was becoming. "His choice," she said simply. "Speaking of choices," Silas said, pulling a small wooden horse from his pocket, a companion piece to the one he'd carved for Elsie months ago. "I thought our new baby might like a toy too." Clara took the carving, admiring the careful details. "How do you know we're having a boy?" "I don't, but every child needs a horse, don't they?" As the sun set over their land, their home, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them here. Sometimes the family you need isn't the one you're born into, but the one you choose to build with love, courage, and hope. Elsie ran up to the porch, her cheeks flushed with play and her eyes bright with happiness. "Mama, will you tell me the story again, about how Uncle Silas found us in the snow?" "It's Papa Silas now, remember?" Clara corrected gently. "Papa Silas," Elsie agreed with a giggle, settling into Silas's lap. "Tell me the story, Papa." As Silas began the familiar tale, their story, Clara closed her eyes and listened to his deep voice, weaving the narrative of how three lonely people had found each other and become family. Outside, the Wyoming wind whispered across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow.